Hello, everybody. How you doing? This is Dr. Hotby again. This is lecture 2 for the late medieval crisis. I walked in today and found that the first lecture, which I had uploaded yesterday, actually didn't upload. So that is now up. I apologize for that. So it's up. I put up a PowerPoint too, and I want to say something about that PowerPoint. I was under the impression yesterday that you could see the PowerPoint as I was going through it. Because when you see what I see right now, I have my PowerPoint. Down in, I have my little box where my video is right down here in the bottom right. And yesterday I thought that you could see the PowerPoint just like you're seeing me. I thought the two were integrated. Well, they're not. So yesterday I was referring to slides in that PowerPoint that that I didn't point out to you. So you might get a little lost in that PowerPoint as I'm going along. It's more or less in order, but today what I'll do, I'm finishing that PowerPoint, so I will identify each page as I go along, so it will help you follow. Last time we talked about the Black Death. We talked about its origins, its transmission, and some of the demographic and cultural consequences of the Black Death. And one of them, of course, being the emergence of a culture which is far more preoccupied with death. And so in a kind of dark way, we talked about the Danse Macabre, the way in which traditional depictions of dead people before the Black Death were, they were serene, they're dressed well, they're going to their God, and you see these carvings all over the place. After the Black Death, it's really kind of, ghoulish. We find emaciated corpses, depictions, worms, rats, all kinds of, terrible critters involved with death. So it's a much more dark period. And I'll come to this later when we talk about the Catholic Church. It does reflect a grave concern that something has gone terribly wrong, and that the terrible death tolls of the Black Death were divinely ordained. Perhaps God is punishing us for our sins, and it's not surprising that people would turn towards the church for spiritual guidance and comfort. And they found that they weren't getting it. They found a clergy that they believed was corrupt and immoral. Just a bunch of fancy bishops and archbishops and popes living off people's labor, people's toil, and never giving some of that wealth down to the parish priests so they could attend to the laity. And so, what we would call anti-clericalism becomes stronger following the Black Death, because the Catholic Church is not seen to be there for its parishioners, for the laity. And so the Black Death to some degree lays the foundations for the Reformation. So when we talk about the Black Death, we talk about a consequence, which is that crisis of the Catholic Church. So keep this in mind. Just want to go over some basic points we made yesterday. Again, population losses European-wide about 33%, sometimes 40%. And we pointed out that the population continued to decline after the 1350s because the plague kept returning. Remember, it was the nature of Pastorella pestis to appear suddenly, create mass mortality, only to lie dormant suddenly. Could go for years and years and years. All of a sudden it's back, and you have another bout of mortality. So, we can talk about that population loss, that sudden shock to the system from, 1347 to 1355, say in there. But it just keeps getting worse as the plague, keeps recurring. And so populations, keep going down and down and down throughout, for another 150 years. I would say more like a century. because we think that populations start to bottom out about 1450. So for about a century, we do see the populations continue to go down and down and down, and this is really going to have a lot of repercussions when we understand how lords and peasants interacted with each other, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. So population losses initially catastrophic, continuing to slide down. And just to give you an idea here, for another reason why the population declines, and that's the 100 Years' War in France. Now, if you go to slide 5 quickly, hold on a second, let me minimize this so I can see it. Sorry about this, I'm not the greatest. There we go. Now I'm back to that population table. It says population change from the Black Death. Again, it's slide 5. And you'll see that I have population figures from this region of Normandy, and then on the right I've got population figures for England. Just want to preface this by saying that the population figures for England are national populations. And these kinds of population statistics are highly speculative, and so they're simply not as reliable as the population figures we have here on the other side for Normandy, which is northwest France. And the reason being is that the Normandy region we're talking about is a pretty large sample for that period, about 108 villages, I think. But even though it's localized and it's not on the national scale, based on what we know about other regions of France, really the population trends that you see there are probably more representative. So to review, we see that basically populations cut in half in this region of France, 56% decline in population from 1347 to 74. Now, as we go down that table chronologically, I want to point out to you that you'll see populations trying to rebound, trying to come back, and that was really the case. And when the conditions were right, populations could recover, and they could recover fairly quickly. But if you go chronologically down that map, you see this kind of stair-step decline in population. So 1374, we're at an index of 43. In other words, 56% of the population, pre-Black Death population, is dead. Look what happens by 1413. You see that the index has increased from 43 to 65. That's quite an increase. It's a 40-year time period. Population change moves slowly. But what we do see, again, is this propensity of the population to try to rebound. Look what happens 12 years later, in 1425. We go from an index of 65 to 34. In other words, we're talking about half the population in 1413 dying 12 years later. What kind of shock to the system would cause that kind of decline? I'll get to it in a second. But again, as we go farther down the map, we're down at that terrible level of 34 after that 12-year period. All of a sudden, 9 years, we're up to 43. Again, trying to rebound this population, only to be knocked down again 35 years later. It's at the lowest rate of the whole period. So what I would point out here is if you look at those indexes, you'll see that by about 1460, population has bottomed out in this part of France. If you look here across at the English figures, we see that the population has bottomed out about 1450 there. I think these are representative of what has happened in Europe more broadly. We see populations finally bottoming out by 1450, and that's really important for understanding the trajectory. Remember I said last time that in some ways the Black Death kind of creates a new slate for a new Europe to emerge. And this is one of the bases, 1450. This is typically where we start the early modern period. So 1450 is, again, we're starting the course here. We'll go forward from that point on. But I do want to get back to that sudden shock to the system from 1413 to 25, when we go from an index of 65 to 34. What happened? Well, in this part of France, and indeed parts of southwestern, take the whole western half of France, take much of the northern half. This is where, at this time in the 1420s, especially in the north, where we have some major battles between the English and French armies. And then we'll find that the English had an ally in Burgundy, which is cousins to the French kings. You don't need to know that. The point is that in northern France, these armies are converging and causing enormous damage. And it's really all of this population collapse in that 12-year period is a result of war. So, keep that in mind, that one of the downward checks on downward pressures on population is not simply recurring bouts of plague, but also man-made activity, these kinds of wars that cause enormous damage and loss of life. So I want to turn now to the 100 Years' War. That really is the second source of the 14th century crisis that we've talked about so far. Obviously the Black Death, and now the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War lasted from 1337 to 1453, so about 116 years. I don't want you to think that armies were fighting all 116 years. They were not. Medieval warfare tended to, wars tended to last not very long, almost typically just maybe a year. Because it took you a long time to build up an army, and then at the end of the battle season, the army would disperse, and you had to build it up again the next year. What made the 100 Years' War so bad, and it's fought in France. It's really fought in France. What made it so bad was that both the English and the French relied more and more on mercenary troops. Mercenary troops, these are troops that have to be paid with money, and when they're not paid, they go on the rampage. They pillage villages, they take livestock, they take grain. Just as you have a rural society that's starting to rebound, and then you have these people come in, they're destroying. I'll give you some examples. During the 30 Years' War, this is in the 1630s. In France, investigators or administrators would send investigators out into these war-torn communities to report on their condition, and the peasants that were still there would tell them all sorts of terrible stuff about what had happened to them. And it's no different during the 100 Years' War than it really was all that time later in the 30 Years' War. So what we find, some of these investigations into these villages in the 17th century talk about, troops coming in, taking 300-400 head of livestock, taking all the livestock, taking all the grain that's threshed or unthreshed. There is really mass rapes. Some terrible stories about this. But the point is that these troops are not just trying to subsist. They haven't been paid, they need bread, but what they're doing is pillaging, marauding. They're often trying to sell what they're taking from peasants in other places so they can get money. Can you imagine going into one of these churches, hiding in a church from these armies, and finally they break in the church, and one of the first things they do is they will get these picks and they'll start prying up the stones on the church floor. And why would they do that? They did that because wealthy people, prominent people, wanted to be buried in the church. And if you, say, walk into, go to Amsterdam, go to the old church, walk in there and you're going to see on the ground basically gravestones. People who were buried underneath there. Well, these troops are going in, they're pillaging the church, they're pulling, because they want to rob the corpses. They want to pillage the corpses to see whatever they can possibly get. So these troops go in, they cause enormous damage to people and to property. And they also bring along disease. They bring along typhus, they bring along typhoid. But these are all downward pressures on population. It's hard for a population to recover when its plows are gone. Who's going to plow the land? Where are the livestock? We've got stories of men, sometimes women, tying themselves up to plows and plowing the land. In fact, we have photos of women in France doing this in 1917. Yeah, during the war, when the men are gone, the horses are gone, somebody's got to plow the land. So you have this destruction of agricultural capital. It's really terrible to try, I think, to try to reconstruct your village and reconstruct your lives and start trying to raise a new family. So the 100 Years' War is very important in exacerbating the population collapse of the Black Death. It just makes things worse. Now, I'll give you just a little idea for that, for the 100 Years' War. I'm not an expert on it. But it really is a war fought between England and France for control of France. It starts out as a dispute between English and French kings over a part of southwestern France. And the dispute is really about, who's the lord and who's the vassal. Who's the superior, who's the inferior. So you have that diplomatic crisis down there. You got that tinder, you need a match, but it's there. But the proximate cause, what really kind of impels it even forward, was a succession dispute between the French and English kings. If you go down to slide 9, you'll see that I have a genealogy here. It's a succession dispute, 100 Years' War. You'll see that Philip IV of France has had 4 children. He had Louis, who was his son. Next oldest was Philip, then Charles, and then a daughter, Isabella. Well, you can see that Philip died in 1314, and under French law, the crown passed from the father to the next oldest son. So you'll see that Louis was king from 1314 to 16 when he died, and then the crown passed to the next oldest brother, Philip, who died in 1322. And then it went to the next oldest son, or in this case the last son, Charles, who died in 1328. The question now becomes, there's no more line. That old line is all died out, so who's going to become the next king of France? And this is where the succession dispute breaks out. You'll see that Philip IV had a 4th child, a woman, Isabella. And if you look at that chart more, you'll find that Isabella was married to King Edward II of England. And that they had a child, a son, who became Edward III of England. The dispute broke out over Edward's claim to the throne. He claimed he was the French king because Isabella was Philip's daughter. He was Isabella's son, therefore the French crown should pass to him. The thing is that the French never believed that royal authority could basically be transmitted through a female. And so the French nobility said, number one, Edward is claiming that he can become king through his mother, when our law doesn't say that. Our law says exactly the opposite. that the line can only pass from men to men and never through a female. And of course, that's Edward's assumption, that he is a legitimate king of France because royal authority can go through his mother. French nobles, the last thing they want is an English king, so they elect their own candidate, which I have down here at the bottom of the slide, Philip of Valois. And Philip of Valois becomes a new king. Well, this is the 30 Years' War. This is how it starts. This is part of the tinder, part of that tinder. Part of the brushwood. What do we call it? Fire starter, whatever. So it's between Edward III and Philip of Valois. And so over the course, again, of 116 years, this dispute continues to be fought by successive kings. Again, not constantly. The point is that, this is a war fought in France. France at this time is the most populous country in Western Europe. And so some of the population losses there are going to skew a little bit some of the broader European losses as well. But, certainly in the French context. And I'd say elsewhere, different kinds of wars, because they're always fighting. They're always fighting. Again, downward pressure on population. So this is why we see that big drop, at least in this part of France. So that's about all I'm going to say about the 100 Years' War. Basically, the argument is it just exacerbates the problem. The Black Death, however, creates a third crisis. And this is hard to explain to students, especially online. So I don't know how this is going to go. It's hard to explain to students because the concepts and the kinds of people I'm going to be talking about are just foreign to modern sensibilities. Like a serf, bound to the land. We have personal freedoms, and these people don't. But that third crisis is what we call the collapse of serfdom in Western Europe. And what that entails, essentially, is that we go from a population in bondage. About 90% of the population, they're peasants, they're farmers, they're people engaged in agriculture. About 90% of the population are serfs. And over a period of about 2 centuries, from 1350 into 1550, they essentially negotiate their way out of serfdom. They become free peasants whose rents are fixed. They can't be taxed at will. So this collapse of serfdom is really important because it gives a lot more power to peasants, but it puts so much pressure on lords. This population decrease puts so much pressure on their income that we see a lot of that old medieval nobility just dying out. And so when that old nobility dies out, somebody's got to come in to replace it. So the early modern period is really about a whole reconstruction of the nobility that rises out of this collapse of serfdom. So I want to go into it with some detail, and I hope it's not too much. I put a discussion board up there to help you along. Now I'm going to slide 12. It is a pie chart, and I've entitled it A Model of the Lord's Estate. Think of it as the manor. Think of it as his estate. A lord not only had rights to land and rights to use the land, he also had rights to the people living on the land. So in one sense, he's kind of like a modern landowner in the sense he has his own land and he can kind of do what he wants with it. But on the other hand, he gave out part of, all lords gave out a part of their estates to these peasants. Because lords don't work. If they don't have a labor force, who's going to work the lord's personal estate? So here on the pie chart, you see what's called the domain. This is a land reserved for the lord's personal use. It's in blue. And you can see at this point in time, and again, it's just a model, that most of the land within the lordship is reserved for the Lord. Now you see this other part called the mouvance. It's in orange. This is the land that the lords give to the peasants to support themselves. And the peasants have to pay, not simply just taxes, sometimes in money, oftentimes in kind, paying grain, paying chickens, but they also have to pay in terms of forced labor. If the peasants who have their land on this mouvance don't pay their dues, they can be kicked off their land. You don't want to be landless as a peasant in this time. You need land. It's the primary source. That's how you support yourself. And so what I want you to understand here is that this is what a lordship would look like. Think of it as a piece of land. They could go miles. They could go for miles. And that the person who, for lack of a better word, owns all the land, nonetheless has to give it out, some of it to peasants, so they could support themselves and work their estates. Now, in 1315, the peasants who are on the mouvance, on this land given to them to support themselves, they're called serfs. And they're called serfs because they're bound to that land. They can't leave their village. They can't leave their land. They have to stay in the village. They have to work the Lord's estate. In other words, they don't have any personal freedoms of any kind. What will happen over the course of the 1350 to 1550 is that we'll see that the peasants actually become, the serfs, I should say, become free men. How does this process work? Let's start. Well, what is a serf? It is, actually, I had a slide 13. If you're a serf, you didn't have personal freedoms of any kind. You couldn't leave the village without permission. You couldn't marry anybody you wanted without the Lord's permission. You didn't have a legal identity. In other words, you couldn't make contracts. So, for example, you didn't own your land. The Lord gave you the land in exchange for these services. So you can't sell it or buy it. You can't will it, give it to your heirs. You certainly can't mortgage it so you can go into debt. This is the Lord's land. And you simply cannot make contracts, like we can today. So if you're a serf, can't leave can't leave the village without permission, can't marry whoever you want, can't make contracts. You're also subject to the Lord's legal jurisdiction. Every lord in medieval and really early modern Europe too established their own courts. And by that I mean they hired judges and paid them. They hired prosecutors, typically later on there'll be notaries and then later on actual lawyers, but who will bring to the judge's attention all sorts of issues in the lordship or on the manor. So for example, I got people fighting. Well, they're going to bring those guys before the judges because the idea here is you got to keep order. Peasants like this kind of legal access. It's very cheap. But yeah, they have an inheritance dispute. The judge can resolve it for them. If they are fighting, which they often will do, all sorts of things like this, like, I don't know, some man said he'd marry a woman with the Lord's permission, and then he decides he wants to marry somebody else with the Lord's permission. The first woman comes back and says, wait a second, you violated our agreement. These were the kinds of issues that came before these courts. But mostly these courts are there to enforce the rules, and the rules work in favor of the lords. So if a serf tries to leave the village and he's caught, he's brought back and he's punished in these courts. Same way with somebody, with illicit marriage. The point of these courts is on one level to keep order within the manor among the peasants, but it's also to enforce all the rights and taxes and obligations of the lord. The point that I want you to understand is that serfs were under the legal jurisdiction of the lord. They had no recourse to other courts. They couldn't appeal the lord's decision. And so they're totally at the legal mercy of their lords. Now, the question arises, what did they owe the lords? These courts, again, are there to make sure that the peasants are paying their obligations. So what were some of the primary burdens and taxes involved in lordship? In other words, if you're a serf, what did you have to do? What did you have to give to the lord in order to maintain your land? The primary burden, the primary thing you owed your lord was free labor. We call it forced labor. We call it the corvée. It's here in the PowerPoint. You're going to need to remember this for a quiz. Now, forced labor. These services varied from manor to manor, lordship to lordship. But generally, you find serfs required to work 3 to 4 days a week on the lord's estate. In other words, you go back to that chart, chart 12, you'll find that all the people on the orange have to work 3 or 4 days a week on the blue. And then, of course, the serf is free to work the land the Lord gave him for his subsistence. He's allowed to work that for the rest of the week. Another thing you owed the Lord, which was basically about anything you wanted. Serfs were taxable at will. In other words, there were no limits on what the Lord, in theory, could ask for. Obviously, practically, you don't want to take everything because they can't support themselves and they're not your labor force. But this notion of being taxable at will, there are no legal limits on what the Lord can demand. Another kinds of burdens, here you are given, I would just say you had to use the Lord's equipment and you had to use it for a fee. So here's a great example. You're a serf, you're on the land the Lord gave you, and you grow wheat, and you need to grind it into flour in order to make bread. The vast majority of people, bread was their primary staple. 3 pounds a day. That would be that'd be a nice little chunk of bread, huh? I mean, this is not like, it's not like Wonder Bread. It's like really heavy, coarse bread. But you couldn't grind your grain in your own mill. Mills were very expensive. Only the Lord could own a mill, and so you had to go to the Lord's mill, and you had to pay him a fee. Now, fee could vary, but often a small percentage, 4% maybe. But you had to give the Lord either the flour, or you had to give, whatever grain you wanted the mill, a certain percentage of that. If you grew grapes and you wanted to make wine, and many, certainly in France, most peasants are making wine. Sometimes it's beer elsewhere, Germany, England. But if you wanted to press your grapes so you can make wine, you had to use the Lord's grape press and wine press. And so you got to pay him a fee. Ovens, get this. We all have ovens in our homes where we can bake our bread. Not so back then. There was one communal oven that typically the Lord owned. You couldn't bake your bread in the Lord's oven without paying him a fee. And so this was, you're forced to use the Lord's equipment and you're forced to pay him a fee. We call those banalités. You don't have to write it down. It's on the PowerPoint here. But those are some of the things you owed your lords. And then, and this is really going to become important later. Let's say by 1350, the income of lords is really most of its income comes from rents. The peasants will have to pay for their land in the form of a rent, sometimes in money, oftentimes in kind, in the form of grain. But for a variety of reasons you don't need to know for now, these lords were fairly reliant on these rents in order to, for their incomes. And we're going to see what the peasants do with them a little bit later. So there you go. You're a serf. You lack personal freedoms. You owe all this stuff to your lord. And the question then becomes, how is it that by 1550 peasants have all their legal freedoms and their primary burdens and taxes are either eliminated entirely or substantially reduced to the point where, the lords after 1550 simply don't have the same legal power and same claims on their peasants as had happened before the Black Death. It's population increase, and it boils down to this. The Black Death created a huge labor shortage. What happens to your labor force when it dies? Again, you don't have as many workers. You have lords who are dealing with fewer workers. Their estates are predicated on having somebody work your land, and the peasants know it. It is this process is complex. We see it happening in different places at different speeds. So this old, serfs or free men pretty much first in England, but the French aren't far behind, Western Germany. And all this plays out not on a national or regional level. It all plays out on the level of the lordship or the level of the manor. Because what peasants do is essentially tell the lord, if you want us to work your land, you're going to have to give us our personal freedoms, and you're going to have to reduce all these taxes and rents. Because if you don't give us what we want, we'll go to some other lord. We'll negotiate a better deal with that lord because he needs labor just as much as you do. And so the Black Death shifts the balance of power between lords and serfs in the direction of the serfs. The lords need serfs far more than serfs need lords. Trust me. Trust me on this. And so when your labor force threatens to leave, and it says, you know what, we can leave the village without your permission, do something about it. I'm going to marry whoever I want. Do something about it. So what you can just do, Mr. Lord, is you can give us our personal freedoms. You have to let us leave the village if we want to. You have to let us marry who we want to. We'll be subjected to your court, but we can appeal decisions out of your court, so you just can't do whatever you want with us. This is what peasants want, and they negotiate their way out of serfdom simply because the lords are so desperate for revenue. I hope that's clear. I mean, it's a lot more complex than that, but that's what you need to know. The whole power balance shifts between lords and peasants because of the Black Death, and the peasants are smart enough to realize it, and they play one lord off after another, and of course, eventually become free men. Now, I have laid this whole process out. It's on, let's see, slide 11. But I do want to give you an idea for what happens to these lords. And you have to try to keep in mind that they thought very, very differently than we do when they thought about economics. There's really no notion of investment. The idea that you spend money on your land in order to make it more productive, it's not there. They don't think that way. It's very exploitive. They take what they can. They take what the system offers them. If anything, they want a larger share of the pie, but the size of the pie, growing the pie is not their concern. That's how we think today. We want more growth because the idea goes everybody gets a larger share. Of course, it's not true, but that's a way of thinking. And a second thing to keep in mind is that there's no concept of inflation. We take it for granted that, prices rise and fall. And we see prices rising and falling primarily in terms of supply and demand. People don't think in those terms. What they want is stability. Change is something that is very threatening. And so they want to avoid it. This is really important for understanding what lords do with these rents that are some of the mainstays of their income. And let me give you a modern analogy. Okay, I rent an apartment over on the south side, not far away. I pay $914 a month for that apartment. The lease is only for a year because the landlord wants the opportunity to raise it next time if the market will bear. And so, we have what we call a very short-term variable lease. Short term of the lease, but the rent over time can change. It's not how they thought then. These lords want stability in a time of crisis. And so they go, so the peasants basically say, we want our rents fixed at a certain level. We want them, and we'll pay money for them. But we want the rent set at one level for a lifetime, 2, even 3 generations. Imagine this. The lords are willing to do this because they want stability. They don't think in terms of inflation. They don't know what's happening. They don't even know what's happening the next year. So imagine my landlord coming to me and say, "Hey, Jeff, you can have this apartment next year for $914, and I don't know, $2117 for $914." It's incredible. So they fix their revenues over time. Now, what happens if you have inflation? If the prices of grain start rising, or the cost of living start going up? The purchasing power of that fixed rent just vanishes. It just vanishes. And so after about 1450, when populations start bottoming out and they start to rise, you see more pressures on resources. And so things like grain prices rise. What happens to these lords is that the mainstay of their income just melts like snow in the sun. That inflation is eating away so much at their revenues that they wind up selling off whole estates to maintain their standard of living. Now that's a smart move, right? Rather than curtailing your standard of living, you keep living like before because that's your status, and you have to maintain your status. And so they start doing what we call in Iowa anyway, they're eating their own seed corn. They're selling off their estates. And before long, many of these old medieval families, aristocratic families, are no longer in the ranks of the aristocracy. Sometimes the family line will run out, in which case that noble family is no more. Sometimes during the 100 Years' War, you'll find nobles killing each other on a large scale, and so you see the ranks of the nobility declining because of war. But so often these lords are selling off their estates. They just don't know how to get out of the crisis. It never, I'll talk about this later, but they don't know how to get out of the crisis. And so you'll find that the wealth of these lords in many cases just dissipates to the point where they're out of the aristocracy as well. And so this raises a question between the natural disintegration of noble families because they, every generation can't leave a son. Nobles killing each other off in wars like the 100 Years' War. And then especially this notion of inflation eating away at their revenues because peasants were able to negotiate them so far down they really had no choice to do it. What we have is the demise of a medieval nobility and the rise of a new one. And we'll talk about this in a couple lectures. But just understand that when I said that the Black Death, that crisis of the 14th century more broadly, really kind of wipes the slate clean for the early modern period, this is one way. We have, the European nobility of the early modern period is a different nobility. So that's highly simplified, but just imagine that fixed rents, fixed in value over 70 years or 3 generations. Sorry. You guys Cubs fan? I'm a big Cubs fan. I just saw that Wilson Contreras did something apparently good. Anyway, but as you go down here, slides 14 and 15 and 16, I really do want you to understand too that one way that peasants negotiate their lords to essentially free them was not just through give us what we want or we leave. They also do it through rebellion and revolts. The 14th century are just rife with major peasant revolts because the first instinct of many of these lords is to force the peasants to stay on the land. The lords try to use force to maintain the old system, and the peasants fight back. These revolts all fail. Peasants lose. The reprisals are so harsh. But it's this willingness of peasants in France, in England, and elsewhere to rise up and defend themselves against these efforts to make lordship even more, basically keep the serfs as serfs. So, slide 14, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. It started when officials of the king tried to collect unpaid taxes. Let's go back to the 100 Years' War, because this is the context. Kings are paying mercenaries. They need money. They have to tax the peasantry because they pay most of the taxes. And so when the peasants refuse to pay, the lord doesn't get their money, so he sends out officials, oftentimes with soldiers, to forcibly collect these taxes. Well, the English peasant revolts emerged in 1381 out of this anger. But it's this anger against royal officials. But what they do during this revolt is they demand the end of serfdom. They're fighting for their freedoms, their newfound freedoms. They rebelled here in England. They killed nobles, they killed clerics, they killed other lords, and again, they lost. But these peasants sent a message, and we're going to lay down for this. Let's see, slide 15. Here I just lay out in writing this kind of process that I was telling you about. But line 16, you see that, or excuse me, not line, slide 16. The French Peasant Revolt of 1358, the Jacquerie. Same thing. Royal officials forced these peasants to cough up their taxes. The peasants rebelled and demanded an end of serfdom as part of that broader revolt. It was probably the most violent one at that period. I'd say through the whole early modern period, all the way in the 18th century, is the most violent revolt. The peasants are sending a message that will fight you. So you can negotiate, or you can have just social conflict, endemic social conflict. Finally, the German Peasants' War of 1524, 25, 26. This is another example where German peasants are fighting back against efforts by lords to basically increase their dues. Some of these German lords had to give up a lot of their rights to peasants, like the ones in England and France. But in the late 15th, early 16th century, they try to impose the old system again, and the peasants fight back. So it's a population decline of the Black Death. Puts the peasants in the driver's seat, so to speak, in terms of negotiation. They demand their way out of serfdom. Do you realize that, give you France, they're working 3 to 4 days a week on the lord's estate as serfs? By the early modern period, they're working maybe 2 or 3 days a year on the lord's estate. And sometimes they had even managed to get lords to convert that forced labor into a fixed rent. That, of course, the value of which evaporated with inflation. So So the peasants really used the Black Death to their advantage, and they did help to establish a new kind of lordship that we'll talk about, particularly in the French case, because it takes the French Revolution in France for that weakened system of lordship to dustbin of history. It's the peasants who overthrow it. I love peasants. Okay, I think that I'll end there. I'm at 50 minutes. I'm going to prime you, though, for one more crisis, and that is the crisis of the Catholic Church. And this will be a shorter lecture. I think it'll probably be, well, we'll carry this into Rural Society, into Module 2. But I'll give you an idea for why it was that so many people turned against the church. Many began to, well, I should say many, but important people tended to rethink their relationship to God in a way that didn't require the church to be a part of their lives. And so it's this anti-clericalism, again, that comes out of the 14th and 15th century crisis that lays a foundation for Martin Luther and the Reformation. So thank you so much. I will be in touch soon. Let's see, it's Saturday, right? I'll do another lecture tomorrow and post it, and I will make sure that this one gets on as well. Thanks. I wish I could meet all you guys. This is so weird, just staring into, I don't know, a light. Anyway, that's the nature of the beast. Take care. Have a nice weekend. You'll hear from me soon. Bye-bye.